probably start by saying I've attended this conference for a couple of years now, and this is the first time I've spoken here, so I'm grateful to for the opportunity to the organisers. Briefly about me, I've worked with or for publishers, both traditional and accidental, on their single source digital publishing for nearly 25 years now, and I spent the majority of my career as a consultant. I now lead the content architecture team at Bloomsbury, and we specialise in XML. I'm going to mention XML a lot. And we supply content and metadata in support of our products. But we wear two hats. Our role is both governance and enforcement. So we set the standard, but we also carry out the quality assurance. And outside of Bloomsbury, I do this work for BSI and ISO, which is schematron, and the reason I mention that again is that it's an XML technology for expressing business rules, so it's directly relevant to quality assurance. And the IST 41 work, that is all, the remit of it is all XML, so it includes things like, it has included things like EPUBs and the Microsoft Office formats. About the company, if you haven't come across Bloomsbury before, we're somewhat unusual in publishing in that we have a foot in both the trade and academic camps. We started as a trade publisher back in 1986. Popularly, we're probably best known for the Harry Potter series, but it's not all about that. And my team works exclusively with the other main division of the company, which is academic and professional, specifically Bloomsbury Digital Resources, or BDR. And briefly about BDR, there is a lot of different types of content, and it straddles both the humanities and social sciences and the visual arts. Too many subjects to mention, but architecture, philosophy, education, law, performing arts, theology, they're all in there. And we also publish other people's content, not just our own, via licensing and white labeling agreements. So the point is that there is an awful lot of content, different content types, and that diversity and range of content can itself present a challenge when you're trying to ensure quality. Just a quick caveat, this is not a case study, nor is it the product of an internal research project. It contains some insights gleaned from colleagues and others' work. But first of all, we're going to need to define our terms, so let's quite carefully, so let's do that first. So some terms of reference, referring back to the title, Content Quality Assurance. So by content, I definitely mean structured data, so XML in the main. And can I just check for reassurance, who here is from an organisation using XML to publish content? That's a relief, thank you. And by quality, I mean, with this formulation, that it is sufficient and consistent enough to meet internal and consumer need. And by that, I mean there's enough to do with it, enough to do what you want with it, and it's represented in the same way or ways as far as possible. And I'm also avoiding talking about end users here because it can imply someone with a login to an online resource, and a consumer could equally be a machine. It could be a discovery service, for instance. And just to round this off, the assurance piece, at least a semi-automated means to ensure those criteria are met. So we could reformulate the whole title like this, ensuring as far as possible by automated means that the XML we use to publish our products and metadata about them is sufficient and consistent enough to meet both internal and consumer need. End quote. The content and data, those two things kind of dog me. When I started in my career at a digital publishing consultancy, it was the first time I'd heard content talked about as a publishable asset in using that word. And it was content versus data was kind of a central debate that was had when XML was being devised in the late 1990s. There were people who were kindly known as doc heads, who were focused on human-authored structured documents, but they had an irregular structure, so they were written by human beings. So that's to be expected. And then there were the data heads who viewed the world as everything being very tightly defined, and it had a controlled structure, the kind of thing that you might enter into a spreadsheet or a database, fixed number of characters in a certain format, something that you could easily police and check. And both of those live happily in XML, and there's no reason why they shouldn't. But I'm talking more about the content type today. A good example of the data type of XML in this sense comes from the world of finance, for example, where banking or trading transactions often have some XML describing them. And because of the high volumes and the need for a lot of accuracy, those formats are understandably very tightly defined and tied down, and machine talks to machine, and they know exactly what they're getting. And you can use existing technology to check those. Things called schemas, which just provide an automated means to validate the information. You can ask a machine, is this XML exactly as I expected it? And the machine will say yes if it is, and no if it doesn't, and it will give you pointers to the places where it isn't. But it's not so easy where there's variability, such as we find in human-authored content. So there's a structure, but it can't be imposed in the same way as you can with data. So the things that you want to mark up, the things whose value you want to exploit, might be hard to locate easily. So coming back to the idea of sufficiency. Say you have a piece of content and your house style mandates that any cited work from the body of the text needs to be linked to the bibliography. It's a very common thing to do. It's a useful feature for users. Say on a digital product, they might click on it and be taken to the bibliography. That's great. The best way to control this is at the point of authoring by, say, entering a cross-reference. But we don't typically have control of that means, and our authors tend not to work in a structured environment that would facilitate this. Or, as I mentioned, the content has already been written. So that ship has sailed. But take this contrived example, the sentence on the lower half of the slide. This thought-provoking book, open bracket, Thatcher, 1979, close bracket. The highlighted part looks to be a citation, Harvard-style citation of a work mentioned in the bibliography. The author's Thatcher, the publication date's 1979. If it isn't linked to the bibliography, we can trap that, flag it as an error, and get it fixed. And the assurance part of it is assuming that your bibliography is well marked up, at least you're getting the author surname and the publication date, and that's relatively easy to police. You can get there with existing tech. You can write a simple, and I should say non-AI tool, to trawl the text for these. It's just a search or a pattern match, but it's not infallible. And I warned you that the example was contrived. Take this sentence. That decade also saw the UK elect its first female Prime Minister, Thatcher, 1979. Now, on the face of it, that probably isn't a reference to the bibliography. That's probably just the author, and we'll excuse their phraseology, clarifying who they're talking about and when. So this would be a false positive thrown up by our non-AI tool, and false positives are the bane of QA, believe me. And we can also say that I think that this kind of example where you're trying to identify what's missing, what hasn't been captured, is amongst the hardest thing to do with a QA tool. Now, for us as human beings, or indeed the tools that we use, we have to read and understand the context to make a judgment. And so it involves some interpretation to speculate what inherent meaning there is in the text that the markup should reflect, but doesn't. And just to say, as a sanity check, I went to ChatGPT last week, gave it both of these sentences, and it confirmed that both contain a bibliographic citation. And other AIs are available. So with all of this as kind of background, kind of problem statement, let's survey what might be on offer from AI. The view from Prague, and what a nice view it is too. In June, I attended a conference called XML Prague, and it's the world's largest markup conference by participants. And understandably, in recent years, there's been a lot of increased interest in AI. I want to call out one particular paper by Marta Bartnicka from Dolby, the audio technology company. They were trialing a variety of AIs on their internal-facing documentation. And so this is not what their customers, their end users use. This is just for their internal purposes. And I believe most, if not all of it, is captured as quite good XML. So they were feeding lots and lots of marked up content into several AIs and watching the effect. You can go and read and watch her presentation, it's all on YouTube, but you can probably guess this came from a desire to make accessing the information that they have more interactive. So they were wanted to ask in a sort of chat scenario rather than have people search for it or laboriously read through it. And the general conclusion, not just from this paper, but this one is kind of indicative, and this was reflected at another markup conference called Balisage in the US, is that you get better results pointing an AI at some content if it's already marked up. Now, with the proviso that those the people presenting had a vested interest in markup because they were that's what they do. I think this kind of stands to reason because if you've gone to the lengths of marking up information, then you've already given the machine a head start with that interpretation piece. One caveat, and there's always a hallucination gotcha. At Dolby, they have a file naming convention which says you will never use spaces in file names. So they asked their AIs when they had been suitably trained, should we use spaces in file names? And it said, yes, you should always use spaces in file names. So it reversed the convention. That might not cause any problems, but bearing in mind that people like aircraft manufacturers use markup for their manuals, you wouldn't want the reverse to be reported to you in that kind of scenario. Another speaker at Prague, I think it was Dave Gullo, shared this graphic, which may well be familiar to many of you. It was the then current version, but the Gartner hype cycle. In case you're not familiar, the curves that is depicted here, you've got a level of expectation up the side and time along the bottom. And the curve goes through various colourfully named phases, which I can't quite see, but there's the innovation trigger over on the far left, up into the peak of inflated expectations, down into the trough of disillusionment in the middle, up the slope of enlightenment and on to the plateau of productivity over on the far right. And this is where presumably most of us want to get to when you're actually realizing some value. I share this because, just to say, there's a couple of interesting points here which might be hard to see. The artificial general intelligence, which has been causing a stir recently, is just about to leave the trigger phase and enter the peak of inflated expectations. And Gartner also estimate how long it will take to reach the plateau of productivity. And for AGI, they reckon it's going to take more than 10 years. Whereas another example is generative AI, and that is about to enter the trough of disillusionment, and it will take another 2 to 5 years to reach productivity. So I offer this, because I think it's worth bearing in mind as a kind of useful corrective. It's all very exciting, but it's also possible to get swept along in the hype. I said it wasn't a case study, but we did conduct an experiment. I think it was 18 months to 2 years ago now. It might have been slightly before the ChatGPT hoo-ha. But it was around alternative text for images. So we have a digital product called the Fashion Photography Archive at Bloomsbury, and it's a very descriptive name. It's hundreds of thousands of images of catwalk shows, very useful to the student and researcher in that field. As you can see from the screenshot, we've got rich metadata, so there's information about the fashion house, the season, the year of the show. There's also, and it's all semantically captured and discrete and in very good shape, information about the designer, Karl Lagerfeld, and what have you. But we can't put this together and use it just as a caption. In fact, you shouldn't, because that's not a very good alternative text. I'm not an alt text author or expert, but this should say something like a woman in a black dress and maybe some detail about the dress. And accessibility, I'm aware from my own experience as well, is a hot topic for publishers right now with the EAA 2025 deadline. But what we did was, we were fortunate enough to have all of our images in the cloud already for delivery to our online platforms, and they have AI services that you can trial, plug in, see how they do for you. So we did so on a sample, because with nearly 800,000, you're not going to do that by hand, realistically. But at that time, the results were not promising. They were rejected by editorial review. Now, this, of course, isn't to say the situation won't get better, and if we trialed it today, we might get much better results. I don't know. But another view that was expressed at that US conference, Balisage, is that, and from people who had taken their own, built their own AIs and were treating them in a walled garden type of way, excuse me, is that if you're unhappy with the results, just wait a short while, try again another week, because the pace of change is so rapid, you may well see improvements. And this example obviously is not about the application of AI to assure quality, but it does throw up an interesting question about quality, because we've used AI to enrich the content, but in fact that entails another level of quality assurance, because we need to check whether what the technology has given us is good enough. But returning to the subject of actually QAing the XML, what tools can we use right now? So I mentioned schematron, and don't worry about the detail of it, but you can express your quality rules using it. And it identifies likely problems, but the downside is it doesn't correct them for you. And this is where something called SQF, Schematron Quick Fix, comes in. It's a complementary technology, and it adds the ability to correct errors. And not only that, but importantly, what can be corrected, or what is corrected, can be controlled by the operator, by the user. So you can have a scenario where it's a bit like accepting or rejecting changes to a Word document or comments in a Word document. So you can cycle through them and say, yes, I'm happy with that, or I reject this one. And this company, Oxygen, we use their tools. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but they're big in the market of technical documentation. I think DITA was mentioned earlier, that they have a lot of tooling around that. It's used a lot in tech pubs. And they've presented this example where you can, and don't worry about the markup and the code here, it's the highlighted parts that are the important ones. You can have a schematron schema, so something that you run automatically that sends your content with a query to your AI of choice. Now, you might be running this, you might be adventurous and use something that's out in the World Wide Web, or you might want to do that in a walled garden. It's up to you. The principle is the same, that you can send queries. And the example here is about, it is from tech pubs, and it's important when you write technical documentation to use the active voice. So the first example, we want to find out whether there's a problem. So we send a query to our AI and says, and with the simple prompt, is the active voice used here? And we send the text along with it. If it gives us a negative response and says no, then we move on to the next step is triggered, the fix one at the bottom, and we can even ask it to reformulate the text by the same means. We send the text with the prompt. And then last of all, which is not shown here, the user has control over whether to accept the proposed change. So I think what I take away from this is that this blended approach can offer benefits. It's been spoken about a lot, I think, since things like ChatGPT came along, but we can use AI as an assistant here rather than whose suggestions you can accept or reject. But the question of what good quality means in this era of AI is not simply about whether a machine can produce plausible results. We know, and we've seen today, I think, in a lot of cases, they can already. But it's whether those results are reliably good enough. And the fundamental issue about QA doesn't go away with the use of AI, because we need to express our quality metric and also define how it's enforced. And in fact, as some machine-generated alt text has shown us, and in Dolby's experience, for example, this side effect arises. Who checks the checker? But how will we know, or when will we know, we've reached Gartner's plateau of productivity for this kind of work? Well, I think a lot of the means are in place already. We can use existing tools, like I showed you, to check XML, but just plug AI in judiciously. And it all comes back to the quality of the results that those AIs themselves can provide. So are we reasonably confident in the alt text for images, for example? I've already said that matters improve over time, and you would hope so. That has been the trend, and quite rapid. My ideal case, probably not in my lifetime, I don't know, depends how long I live, is that perhaps you could have documents marked up by AI sufficiently and consistently to start with. So you don't, in a way, if the quality from the trained machine is there, then what do you need to QA anymore? The quality's there from the start. But as far as I can tell, that is some way off. Fred Brooks wrote in a famous book called The Mythical Man Month, all programmers are optimists. Possibly because getting a machine to do your bidding can seem a bit like magic or alchemy, and that kind of gives you a little boost. I confess I fall squarely in that camp, but it is a head versus heart thing. I want to believe, and AI holds a lot of promise, but I'm also reminded of someone who's much more experienced than I am in the markup game, who was talking at a conference about being a grad student in the 1970s, and she was told by her instructors that automated subject indexing, the classification of content, is just around the corner. And 50 years later, she said, it's still around the same corner. I'm hopeful. And I'm looking forward to doing more research myself, but at the same time, I need to see evidence from results. And I'm convinced that a blended approach of human oversight of AI results feels prudent. And this also, I think, aligns with the kind of benefits we've seen from other automation to date, of whatever kind. The machine saves us time and effort, but it's not a direct replacement for the operator. It just enhances their productivity. Thank you for your attention.
Hi there. Did you manage to solve the automated image descriptions problem? Because I think I was watching it it did a terrible job. When you were trying it, they did a terrible job. Did you come back and see whether it's improved?
Not yet, no.
Not yet. Okay. So how have you solved it for the time being? Are you just throwing people at it?
I'm not sure how much I can talk about it,
Right.
but it's a work in progress.
It's a work in progress.
I'll come back next year.
So genuinely, because we've done a bit of playing with some of the stuff that you can get in Azure, and a couple of years ago, exactly the same experience. Our more recent experience has been that it's actually seemingly got very, very good indeed.
Yes.
Actually, surprisingly good would be my thought on that. Just to, yeah.
That's encouraging to hear. Thank you.
Yeah.
So when you send, I don't know if you send all the XML to the LLM or not, and I don't know which models you're using, but if you are, then that is a ton of additional tokens. Have you had to have a concern or a thought about like token stashing or the cost profile of that, or are the things that you're working with right now just not at the scale where you're even worried about that?
To be honest, we've only dipped a toe, really. But I think that's all. If it ever comes, it's down the track. But.
Thanks, Andrew.